Hi, I'm Alan. Welcome to the Overland Legend. Today I'm going to talk about something that nobody wants to talk about. They don't even want to admit it. And especially husbands and wives don't want to talk about this. It's just far too risky. Even best friends don't talk about this. And even when they do, they speak in hushed tones and mumbled voices. But today I'm going to talk about this. And I'm not going to hold back. I am going to give you the nitty-gritty, the unadulterated facts. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything. It's not going to be pretty. But you deserve to hear this, and you need to hear this. When you see old Land Rovers for sale, you will notice the huge range in price. Now and again you see a real bargain, but most of the time these days you see price tags for Series 1, 2 or 3 Landies that are sky high. Some of them cost around 500 to 600,000 Rand, the same price as a late model of the original Defender. Well, when you see what it actually costs to restore them, you'll start to understand why. When I started this restoration, I did a budget of what it would cost me. I had a pretty good idea of what needed to be done, but granted I wasn't really up to date with all the replacement prices. But now as I'm getting towards the end, I've got a pretty good idea of what this total restoration is going to cost me. And I have to say, it's really not what I expected. So in this video, I'm going to share with you what my total restoration cost has been. And it'll give you a good idea of exactly what it costs. And you can look at the different scenarios and where the cost lies when you do a restoration like this. In a previous video I did on tips and tricks of restoration, I talk a lot about the different options that you have when you do a restoration. So if you haven't seen that, then please have a look at that video. You can find the link on the screen or in the description below. The two biggest factors influencing cost are number one, the type, condition and completeness of your starting vehicle, and number two, the level of originality and finish that you are aiming for. These two factors will also affect the value of your end result, so they go hand in hand. It's a continual trade-off between how original it will be and how you are restoring it to be used or to be a showpiece and fetch the highest price. Generally speaking, the older your vehicle is, the higher the cost for restoration will be. This is because the older vehicles are scarcer and their parts difficult to come by. But this is not always the case, as I've noticed in North America where the Series 2A vehicles seem to fetch higher prices than Series 1 vehicles. But in most other places, including here in South Africa, the Series 1 costs significantly more to restore and is valued as more. Whichever way you look at it, there are many hours involved in restoring an old Land Rover, whether you have the complete or incomplete vehicle. If you have a complete vehicle, you still have to take everything apart, clean it and reassemble it, a very time-consuming process. Sure, you can replace some parts, but your choices are limited to very expensive rare original or substandard reproduced parts. So often your best bet is to restore the original parts. If your vehicle is incomplete, then you are forced to buy replacement parts. And so the more original and complete your vehicle is, the better off you'll be. But on the other hand, you will probably pay for this in the original purchase price of the vehicle if you buy a more complete vehicle. My Series 1 was abandoned and I recovered it for free, but it was incomplete and in a terrible state. So what seems like a great deal initially will end up costing you later. The biggest problem with an incomplete vehicle is not knowing which parts you have and don't have. The bigger items can be accounted for, but unless you have the parts manual memorized, it's almost impossible to account for all the smaller items and to make sure that you don't miss something. Even if you manage to do this, you cannot always tell if the parts are reusable. This you will only find out sometimes once you have cleaned them and try to reassemble. This is why a complete working vehicle is so much better, because you can be pretty sure that the parts are still usable because they are there and working. On my Series 1, I had all the body parts except for the gearbox tunnel cover, radiator panel, door top and tailgate. Mechanically I was missing an engine, rear axle and the instrument switches and electrical parts. I had a chassis and a firewall which seemed fine, but once I had sandblasted and properly inspected it, it became clear how much work was involved. The chassis needed major work, with almost 40% needing replacement, and the firewall was completely rebuilt. Then on disassembly, I found that many of the smaller mechanical parts in the clutch and steering were too worn, so I've had to replace them or have them remade. These were big surprises that pushed the final cost up significantly. There are no shortcuts when it comes to the chassis and firewall. If these are done properly, the vehicle will retain significant value and be usable for another whole lifetime. When we look at the actual costs a bit later, you will see how much it cost me to fix these major items, as well as buy the missing parts. By definition, a restoration means that you restore the vehicle to its original condition. But it's not that simple, because there are many varying degrees of originality, like restoring all the original parts, replacing original parts with OEM or aftermarket parts, upgrading parts with later Land Rover model parts, or modifying and replacing parts with non-Land Rover parts. The best definition that I came up with recently on restoring a Land Rover is in a recent book that's been put out by a long-time Land Rover owner with a huge amount of experience. This book by John Capenye is very useful, and he's got such a great description in here about restoring Land Rovers. And this is the one over here. He's got these two descriptions. The first one is the rivet grading, which is really fantastic. And you can see that it goes from 5 to 0, from the absolute pinnacle of originality down to very good, borderline between restoration and rebuild, a reasonable rebuild, the minimum to be a Series 1, and then nothing left to count. And then he also has a look at the quality of the restoration on the next page, which is great. And this one is the spanner grading. And this one goes from 5 down to 0. And from 5, it cannot be bettered, very good. 3 is the worker wouldn't probably pass a trade test. Then you get down to a reasonable rebuild, a bit rough, don't go there, and 0 is a botch. So it's really quite, when someone says they've restored or rebuilt a vehicle, it's quite a subtle difference. And it does really make a difference, and you'll see at the end that it makes a big impact on what the actual cost of the vehicle is. If you start off with a good condition, original, complete series vehicle, then restoring the original parts can be a cost-effective solution. Although you will need some specialist skills to restore some of these parts properly. The older and worse condition of the vehicle, the more expensive the sourcing of the original or new replacement components will be. The most expensive restoration is if you have an incomplete vehicle and want to restore it to original. My restoration goal has been to keep the vehicle as original as possible and replace some of the missing parts with later more common or more usable Land Rover parts. I've tried to keep the 107 as aesthetically original as possible, so that it looks original, but some mechanical parts are from a Series 2 or a Series 3. I was missing an engine and a rear axle, so I have used the engine from a Series 2 and the axles from a Series 3. Using anything non-Land Rover is completely unproductive for a restoration, as what you will save in rebuilding, you will destroy in value of the finished vehicle. Getting back to the cost variation of restorations, it really comes down to the quality of the restoration. Restorations are not complicated, and anyone can do it with a set of tools and some paint. But the end result comes down to the finer details of the restoration. And when you look closely, you will be able to see the difference. When you look at it from a distance, everything looks good. But when you look at the details, you will be able to see the difference between a good quality restoration and a poor quality restoration. The real pinnacle of doing a really good restoration is a nuts and bolts restoration. And that means removing every single part down to the last nut and bolt of the Land Rover, and cleaning every single bolt and inspecting every single part of the vehicle, and then restoring it back to its original quality, and coating it and preparing it properly, and then reassembling it according to the manual. So the restorations that you will see will have varying degrees of that amount of effort. And there's not many people or businesses who go to that length of effort simply because it takes such a long time and it's such a high cost. And sometimes you can argue that it's not always necessary to go down to that level of detail. However, the flip side to this is where a coat of paint is applied to make it look good, and a mix mash of incorrect fasteners, poor repairs, and incomplete finishing is presented as a quality restoration. This is unfortunately more common than not, due to the cheap work and lack of know-how. My approach has been to ensure perfect mechanical functioning and best aesthetics where possible. So I have checked the mechanicals and replaced all the seals and rebuilt or replaced where necessary. From my list of the costing, you'll be able to see what was replaced or rebuilt. I chose to repair all of the bodywork because I wanted to retain the original panels. They are not perfect, but I think it's part of the character of this vehicle and the story of how I found it. The bonnet and the doors, however, have been reskinned with new aluminium because they were just too damaged and irreparable, so they look like new. Another large cost was buying a new replacement wiring harness rather than doing my own wiring. Besides saving time, this has meant that I can be 100% sure that the wiring is correct by color and size to the manual, and safe, and that it will work faultlessly. Definitely a worthwhile spend. Restorations are a time-consuming process, especially if you decide to restore the original parts. It becomes a trade-off between labor cost, project time, and the cost of replacement parts. If you do this yourself out of the love of the project, then the time won't cost you any money, but it will cost you in other ways. Like for me, it cost me in family time. It cost me in time to go away and time to go on trips. Obviously, I enjoy it, and the accomplishment of completing the restoration is rewarding. If you pay someone else for the labor time, if you outsource it, then obviously it will cost you a lot more. The parts that I outsourced, like the chassis, the firewall, the body repairs, and the painting, are the parts that cost me the most. But they were also the parts that would have taken me the longest, and I was least prepared to be able to do those. So considering everything that I've talked about, you can understand that it's very difficult to have the same cost for all different restorations. There are just so many variables when you consider the originality, the level of work, who does it, how much you do, how long it takes you. It's all going to impact the end cost. The costing analysis of my restoration is unique to me and what I've done. But you know what I've done and how much work or what work I've put in, what I've changed and what I haven't changed and how I've done it. And so that should give you an idea of what this type of a restoration costs, and perhaps a slightly different restoration will cost. And tallying up these costs has really given me an appreciation for the high cost of some of these restored Land Rover Series 1 vehicles. It's also given me an appreciation for the cost of new cars. If such an old Land Rover can cost so much just to restore it, I can only imagine what it costs to build some of these new vehicles. Three of the biggest costs account for 46% of the total cost, and are those items that are outsourced. So they will include a large portion of labor and skill. The chassis and firewall were in very bad condition and needed to have a proper repair, with the firewall being completely rebuilt. This was far beyond my skill level. The body also required aluminium repair and then repainting. But these are also the biggest and the most important parts of the restoration, so it stands to reason that they are the most expensive. The other big ticket item is the electrics and the small bits, accounting for 14% of the cost. This is a combination of many small bits that add up but are also unique, hard to find and expensive. But these little details are important to make the restoration look proper and worth it. The only other significant costs above 10,000 Rand are the gearbox recon at 5%, and that was outsourced, as well as the rims and new tires, which were 8% of the cost. As for the rest of the restoration cost, it's a sum of lots of small bits and pieces, but they add up and contribute to 27% of the cost. So my total cost is in the region of 230 to 250,000 Rand, or somewhere around $13,000 to $14,000. It's important to remember that I've not included a cost for the original vehicle, which was recovered for free. Also, there is no cost for the engine, because I already had one available. And if you add in the costs that I've not incurred, then it would be around 300,000 Rand or $17,000. I recently came across a cool time-lapse video by Loz L, where he tracks the cost and time for a full mechanical restoration on a Series 3 in the UK. Interestingly, the costs are in the same ballpark. Check the screen for the link or the description below. I have underestimated the cost of this restoration, and I've had many unexpected expenses. It's scary to think that I've spent double what I thought I would spend. But I did have many unexpected expenses, like the firewall and the chassis. And then as I went on, I realized that taking shortcuts was just going to detract from the value of the vehicle. And so I opted to rather do more proper restoration on many of the parts. There's significantly more value in a full proper restoration than a partial rebuild or restoration. And that's because you end up with a vehicle that's basically like new. And that new vehicle translates into reliability and avoiding any future problems. And there's a huge value associated with that, which is really worth it in the end. Now that I look at this, it's much easier to understand why there is such a high cost on these fully restored Land Rovers. But it's also very important to understand what has and has not been done. So I hope this will help you when you look at the value of vehicles to understand what the value of the vehicle should be when you consider a newly restored vehicle, when you look and see what has and hasn't been done. But at the same time, it can also help you to understand what the cost of an unrestored vehicle should be when you look at what will need to be done and how much work will be involved in getting it back to original, and perhaps what parts are missing and what you would need to get to put it back together so that it's complete and original. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and you found it really useful when you consider what it costs to restore a Land Rover. If you've enjoyed this video, then please like it, also share it, and if you haven't subscribed, then please do. And thank you so much for watching.